So sorry about that, guys.
We can hear you and see you.
Sorry about that. Okay, so everybody's here. Everybody was waiting on me. So let's get started at 4:07. I will call the Los Altos City Council study session of Tuesday, October 26, 2021 to order. City Clerk, can you please call the roll? And before you do that, I do want to read for the record for those listening, and I'm reading this on behalf of Vice Mayor Enander. In order to accommodate Vice Mayor Enander this evening during tonight's meeting and the other meetings we have, she will be emailing her questions and comments to our City Clerk, who will then read them into the record. These emails will be made part of the public record. And so thanks for your patience in waiting for me to join. And I also ask for your patience as we go through this process of accommodating Vice Mayor Enander this evening. And so with that, City Clerk, can you please call the roll?
Yes. Councilmember Lee Ing.
Here.
Councilmember Meadows.
Here.
Councilmember Weinberg.
Here.
Vice Mayor Enander. She is here. I can see her. And Mayor Fliger.
Here.
Thank you. We have a full council, five council members present.
Thank you. So let's keep going. And the next agenda item is public comment. And this is a study session with two different items. And so I plan to take public comment on each item, as opposed to how we normally just do one public comment for the sole study session item. And so with that, I do want to open our discussion items with number one, which is the Los Altos Housing Element Update and Community Engagement Strategy. And so for those who are listening, as I mentioned, we will take your public comment after staff presents and after council has had an opportunity to ask questions. And before I turn it over to staff, I do want to thank everybody calling in to weigh in and get this update on our housing element engagement strategy. One of the primary goals of the housing element update is to have jurisdictions adequately plan how we will meet the housing needs of everyone in our community. The housing element is essentially the blueprint for housing in our community. It addresses the housing needs of who will live, work, and play in Los Altos. Therefore, getting this legally required public participation portion of the process right is very important. So to council, community leaders, residents, advocates, interest groups, and everyone listening and will be participating, I say thank you in advance for your help and cooperation and collaboration in ensuring that we have a successful process. So thank you, and with that, I will turn it over to staff.
Excuse me, Madam Mayor, I believe you were going to take public comment first. This, or was it going to come after the staff presentation?
After the staff. So we're going to follow the normal process where staff presents, council will ask questions, and then we'll open it up for public comment.
Great, thank you very much for that clarification. So we have Madam Mayor, members of City Council, John Biggs with your Community Development Department. We have an update for you on the housing element and an overview of the community outreach strategy. And to start off the presentations by staff this morning or this afternoon, we have Guido Persicone, who's our Planning Services Manager, and he will begin. And that will be followed by Sonia Lee, our Public Information Officer, and she will wrap up and then will be available for questions. So Mr. Persicone.
Let me get and share the presentation for everybody first, and let me put it in presentation mode. Can everybody see this all right? Okay, perfect. Thank you. Saw a thumbs up from Councilmember Weinberg. Okay, go ahead, Guido. You can start us off.
Good evening, Council. This is a joint venture with Sonia and I, and obviously John Biggs also participating. So a lot has transpired since June 8th. We had a subcommittee formed in July. We met with the subcommittee 3 times, and we're here to kind of report out to the rest of the council in terms of what we've been working on and the overall outreach strategy and engagement policies. So next slide, please. Not the second slide. Yeah, so just the overall context, our arena number is approximately 1,958. We are trying to plan a little bit above that so we don't get into no net loss provisions of state law. So we are trying to plan for approximately about 2,400 units. The time frame for this housing element is from 2023 to 2031. This is a joint venture between the state and the city to address housing needs. This is the only element of the general plan that the state does certify for now. And the housing element cycle does require us to do broad community outreach. And for this cycle specifically, we do have to affirmatively further fair housing, and try to say that 3 times fast. So next slide. So for the last housing element cycle, there were multiple goals that we were trying to achieve, trying to find appropriate locations and housing types throughout the city, ensuring that there's housing needs for all income levels, ensuring that the housing is accessible, is energy efficient, and complies with recent changes to state law. Now I'm going to pass it off to Sonia.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll take it from here. So after speaking with the subcommittee in depth on what they were looking for in an outreach and engagement plan, we came up with a vision that really has 3 elements. And it is an inclusive, diverse, and adaptive outreach and engagement plan. So this is something that you're going to see over the next year, and what we have planned for our phased approach, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit, but you'll see this throughout the presentation. So as we move on to the next slide, what is our engagement going to be? How are we reaching out, or who are we reaching out to within the Los Altos community? This is something that was really important that the subcommittee highlighted, and we were able to divide it up into 4 different categories. Our first category is residents and community members. So those who live and reside in Los Altos, community organizations, neighborhood groups, homeowner groups, those who work on Los Altos, and much more. And then we have our advocacy groups. That is housing advocacy, developers, tenant advocacy, unhoused, social service groups, so on and so forth. And then our third group is faith-based organizations, and because of AB 1851, this is extremely important in the housing element update process because there's a potential for housing on-site for faith-based organizations, so engaging that part of the community. And then finally, our government officials. So this was really developed to be able to reach every segment of the Los Altos community. Now, as we move forward, I discussed before a phased approach, and this is something that we had come up with for our outreach and engagement. So over the next year, we want to divide it up into 3 phases. Our first phase, which is really important for the subcommittee, was education, awareness, and reflection. And then our second phase would be refining and affirming values. And then finally, phase 3 would be moving towards adoption. I'm going to dive into what each of those phases involves in the next couple of slides. This is really just an overview of what these 3 phases look like. And then just to mention, before I dive into those slides, really every phase has a focus, a type of outreach that we're doing, and then an outcome. So as we enter phase 1, which we estimate to be from November 2021 to February 2022, really our emphasis for this is awareness, education, and reflection. We do have 2 focuses for this period of time, or for this phase, and that is staff engaging the community in a thorough education effort so that they understand what the housing element update process is, and they're able to make decisions on that, more informed decisions. And then our second focus is the community is going to reflect on the housing element goals, which Guido had touched upon a couple of slides ago, so that they can share their values to be able to advise policy updates. So what is the outreach going to be for this? It's going to be a little bit of an overview, and then the next slide I'll dive into all the different elements of what that is. But our outreach, I would say, is a hybrid. We're going to go with traditional and digital communications methods. We have in-person outreach, virtual meetings, printed collateral, and community workshops planned for this phase. And then finally, our outcome is identifying the community's values, priorities, goals, and their needs based off of the input that we do during this period of time. So as I said before, I was going to dive into what all those elements of outreach are so that we could really engage, participate, and have great collaboration during this process, as we would like it to be as robust as possible. We are still in COVID and we don't know what the pandemic is going to be like over the next year. So we are trying to offer as many options as we can to outreach or reach out really to the community. And we want to be able to touch on every segment of the Los Altos community. So we're doing this in a variety of different ways, traditional and digital. Some of the traditional methods that we're using are posters, banners, mailers, CanVT, sandwich boards, and things along those lines. There's many things on this list that were not mentioned, but we believe that these are some of the most effective methods that we've used in the past. And then finally, some of the digital methods that we're using are social media, the city website, informational presentations, whether they're virtual or in person, and then of course our email list. Finally, the last thing, which you guys can all see the example to the left hand of the screen, is our Los Altos Housing Element project website. Now, currently it's under construction, but it will be ready soon after we wrap up this meeting and are able to get feedback and integrate that all in. But this is where we're going to have educational information, ways that people or the community can participate, and so much more. So that is going to all be on this webpage. So as we're talking about reaching out to the community, how are we going to engage the community? How are they going to be able to share input? So we do have a couple of examples here that we are going to be, that we're proposing. And some of those are, or 4 of them are listed. One is community workshops, and I'm going to dive into a little bit of what each one is because they do sound a little similar. So community workshops are going to be run by our consultant, and that is something that the entire community is invited to. It's really an informational session, and then feedback is going to be provided by our community members. And then we have pop-ups, something a little bit similar to what is shown on the screen with our city manager at his pop-up at the farmers market. We're going to really utilize Los Altos events and whatever we can to really just pop up a tent, provide information about the housing element, and then be able to receive that feedback from community members. And this is going to be throughout Los Altos. Now we move into small group meetings. This is something that we're offering on our dedicated project website. So for individuals who would like to receive an informational presentation and be able to provide feedback, they're going to be able to request it on the website. And they can request it virtually or in person. We want to be able to provide that hybrid option for those who don't feel comfortable having somebody over or having somebody come in person. And then finally, our group sessions, which is something where we have received a very expansive list from our subcommittee, and that is growing and continues to grow as we have this presentation today of reaching out to all of these different groups, providing an informational presentation, and then receiving feedback from them. So as we move on to the next part of the presentation, here is phase 2. So phase 2 is actually broken up into 2 parts. It's 2A and 2B. 2A is going to be from March to June 2022, and 2B is July to September 2022. And one of the reasons why this is split up is because 2A is specifically the city's time to work on the housing element, and then July to September is HCD's time to review. So as we go through the focus, through the outcome, our focus for this is really developing a draft housing element to be shared and evaluated by community members, by our planning commission, by our city council, and then of course, HCD. So our outreach for this is community workshops, and then we do have public hearings with the planning commission and the city council. And then finally, our outcome for this is drafting a housing element that reflects the community's efforts to address housing needs, and then of course, certified by the state. So again, HCD does have 90 days to review the draft, which is what 2B is from July to September 2022. So now as we move on to phase 3, it's also split up into 2 sections because of HCD's review time. For this, it is moving towards adoption. And our focus for this phase is seeking approval of the final draft from the state and then of course from our government officials. And our outreach for this is really just going to be public hearings with the Planning Commission and the City Council. And that's going to take place from October to November 2022. And then finally, 3B, which is our outcome, is HCD certifies the housing element update. And HCD has about 60 days to review the final submission, which is December 2022 to January 2023. So with that, questions?
Thank you so much, Sonia, for that overview. Very helpful. And, on behalf of the Council Subcommittee, thanks for meeting with us, I think, a couple times so that we could put this together. So let's go to Council to see if they have any questions for you or Guido on the presentation. And I can see all council members on my screen, so you can raise their, go ahead, Council Member Weinberg.
Thank you, Mayor. And Ms. Lee, thank you very much for the presentation that you just gave us. And thank you to the subcommittee for working so hard with staff to put this together. I just have 2 quick questions. The first is, I can see that an awful lot of information and input is going to be gathered in this process from beginning to end. How is all of that information and the residents' contribution, the community's contribution, going to be aggregated and synthesized and used?
Guido, would you like to take that question?
Sure. I mean, so there are some state mandates of us proving we've done outreach to special housing needs groups. So we have to, show that we've sent letters and, to meet our minimum. But I think the larger contextual question is we will absolutely be tracking how many people are on the website and what comments we're getting. And, when we have the workshops, trying to come up with themes and comments and concerns, and trying to definitely not have the council read every single comment, but hopefully come back when we have our study sessions and say, hey, here's the 8 to 10 major concerns, themes, or comments that we heard. But yeah, so there are definitely some state mandates that we have to require. And then there's also kind of the legwork of kind of aggregating all of that into the themes for the council and commission. So I'm not sure if John wanted to add.
I did, and we'll also be working very closely with our consultant team and collecting all the information that we're going to be collecting and gathering at these workshops and these one-on-one individual meetings with groups or teams of people. And we're going to be a conduit to the consultant team, because staff is really going to be doing a lot of, or the bulk of the community outreach and meeting with the citizens and various interest groups here in Los Altos. And we'll be keeping a tally of the key points that are raised, not only at the large workshop meetings, but also these individual meetings, so that we can kind of monitor and adjust as appropriate what we are hearing and what we are learning. So it's really going to be kind of a Herculean tracking and record keeping effort, but it's something that's going to be very important in order to achieve a housing element that can be certified by the state. And it goes towards demonstrating to the state the efforts that the city has undertaken to do appropriate and comprehensive and broad outreach to the community.
Okay, great, thank you. My only other question is, do you intend to share HCD's input with the public?
We do.
Yeah, it's a public record. It's a public letter. Yeah, absolutely.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Weinberg. Councilmember Meadows.
Yes, thank you for this. And thank you also, Guido and John, because I know everyone in the subcommittee and Sonia have all worked hard on this. So I want to confirm, I'm looking at the slide showing phase 2. And it looks like if we look at when HCD has 90 days to review the draft, that we're getting that draft to them. I'm not sure if it's end of June or sometime in July. Do we have, it looks like we're at the latest, we're getting a draft to them in July sometime in 2022. Is that correct?
That's correct. We are hoping for, or we are planning for the June delivery to the state, and get that running so that they have it at the beginning of July and can start their review as quickly as possible.
Okay, so that's a nice tight timeline for everyone. We better get our running shoes on because there's a lot of work to do. Sorry, that's a comment. That's not a question. A question, then one other question is how do we bring along those in our community who, maybe don't feel we should be doing this or don't want to do this? Obviously, we have to do this and we want to do this, but how do we bring along those who do not?
Well, that's a very good question. And I think the first outreach effort where we get out into the community and provide a lot of education about what the housing element is, why it's required that we do it, what the state rules and regulations are, and what flexibility the city has in determining the program's goals and policies in the housing element is really going to be key. I think that letting the community know and being honest with them up front early in the process what we can and can't do and what is expected of the city is really going to help us in the long run. And we will need to, at the point where we have the information, we're going back out into the community and sharing, what the work of the housing element has been accomplished. We may need to go back to some of these earlier educational efforts to remind the community of what needs to be done and why it has to be done. But I think that can be abbreviated, and we can demonstrate that these are the whys, and this is the outcome of what the analysis has revealed and shown us here in Los Altos.
Thank you. That's my questions.
Thank you, Councilmember Meadows. Councilmember Lee Eng.
Thank you all again for setting up this process and allowing us to really understand the next steps. What would have been helpful for me was to make sure or to see a draft as to what information the public will be receiving on what you will be using to explain this housing element. And I was hoping to see a little bit about that. And that way we could really be able to help identify what helpful tips we have experienced as far as public engagement, and what we understand how sometimes we need to emphasize certain things. So I was just wondering, do you have a draft of that? Because one, I want to make sure that, okay, I'll let you answer that question first.
I was just saying, we have been working with the consultants on PowerPoint presentations and informational sheets for the start of the educational process, and we can make that available to the council when we finalize it, which I expect to be occurring here fairly quickly. And we can also put that up on the city website so that more individuals can look to and see, kind of the information that we're going to be going out into the community and sharing. And so it kind of gives us, a broader outreach, I believe, through making it available, all that information available on our website.
If I may as well, just going back to the timeline we're working with, I appreciate Councilmember Lee Eng's question and Mr. Biggs' response that we would make it publicly available either online or other means. But I do want to remind council, one of the benefits of having myself and the vice mayor serving in the subcommittee role is that we don't delay the process where we bring back things like this to a council meeting, because it would delay the process. And so I imagine the vice mayor and I will continue to work closely with staff and the consultant on the engagement strategy and the materials. And I will say, Councilmember Lee Eng, both the vice mayor and I have emphasized many times how important this educational piece of the strategy needs to be in engaging the community.
I appreciate that. I thought that when I asked for this to come forward or pushed for this to understand the process as well as that, we'd be seeing some of that. So that's why I was just asking about that. So I do know that you and that you, Mayor, and the Vice Mayor are very knowledgeable in this area, but sometimes we all see things differently, and you know, we just wanted to be helpful in providing helpful tips that we feel that might, certain points may need to be accentuated, or like a slide may not be as clear, such as the second slide in what you were presenting today. I would have, you know, I think that certain clarity wouldn't be needed, and I would have done things differently or made suggestions. And I thought that's also what today was all about. So thank you.
No, thanks, Councilmember Liang. I am looking to see if the Vice Mayor would like to comment, and while I wait to see her hand raised, I will just, Sonia or John or Guido, just to follow up on that, just more details in some of the different groups we plan to engage with. As we have mentioned already, the government code, what we're doing is legally required, and we actually have to submit a description of the community engagement that we did, the different groups we reached out to and the input we received from them. But can you talk about the different groups that we've already discussed in our community that we plan to ensure are part of this participation?
Sure, John, I can speak to some of that. So.
Go ahead, Guido. And then I think Sonia is also ready to address that as well.
Yeah, John and I have personally met with multiple groups. The one that comes off the top of my head is Housing Choices. They're developmentally delayed or disabled individuals group that came and spoke to John and I about 2 weeks ago, John, I believe. Correct. And just making sure that, and I forgot the name of the bill. I think it was AB 383. It was the last housing element cycle. You're required to do outreach to individuals with disabilities. So they just wanted to make sure they were on our radar. We've also spoken with a public advocacy group. They're a law firm that is involved with a lot of different housing elements in Santa Clara County. And there was one other group that off the top of my head, I can't remember, but yeah, we've been reached by several groups already. I'm keeping a memo of all the interested parties who've reached out to the city already. And yeah, absolutely, they will be roped in. John, if you wanted to add or.
And I was just going to comment that we do have a extensive and growing list of other groups and parties and organizations that we're going to be going out and meeting with. As Ms. Lee mentioned, either over online by virtual meetings or in person. And I think Ms. Lee has a kind of a list of, maybe she wants to mention some of the groups that we have so far and we'll be going out and meeting with, at least reaching out to, and kind of seeing if we can invite ourselves to some meeting that they're having.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. I apologize.
No, go ahead, Sonia, please.
No. And some of those groups were from projects that we've done in the past, other community engagement and outreach campaigns. And then some of those groups, or a large part of those groups, were provided by the subcommittee. And we've been looking for contact information. And as I've said before, that list is growing. I believe that we have over 150 or 200 contacts for groups or people who are related to different groups within the Los Altos community. So again, that list is growing. And if there is anybody else that we don't currently have on the list, then you could always send them our way.
No, thanks, Sonia. And I will just describe the broad categories instead of her going through the 150 names or more. It's, all levels of income, tenants, property owners, business owners, homelessness, support service groups like CSA, mental health, domestic violence, religious institutions, seniors, affordable housing advocates, Chamber of Commerce, neighborhood groups, schools, parents, the League of Women Voters, Rotary, and the list goes on, but I do want to mention these so that the community listening is aware of the fact that we do plan to engage with all the different interest groups so that we can have a robust participation process and have a successful housing element. Councilmember Liang.
I want to make sure that we include the veterans groups. There are multiple veterans groups out there. And so if we could include them, that would be great.
Thanks for that. And that is on the list, but I'm happy you mentioned that, Councilmember Liang.
Absolutely.
So I don't see any more hands from council members, so let's go to public comment. City Clerk, and then we can come back to see if there's any discussion and close this study session so we can move on to the next one.
Excuse me, Mayor, I do have a comment from Vice Mayor Enander.
Please go ahead and read it.
Okay, her comment is, in addition to the content on the educational message and detail on the specific groups, we expect shortly to have a more detailed calendar of specific meetings and events. All of the meetings will be noted on the website. The end.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you, Vice Mayor. So if no other questions from council members, City Clerk, let's see. I see 5 hands raised, so let's go to public comment.
Okay, so the first speaker I have is Elaine Haight.
And let's give each speaker 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, thanks for inviting us here today. And a group that's been excluded from living in Los Altos forever has been people that don't drive a car and they don't have a lot of extra wealth to rent a parking space when they don't need it. And so I'd like to ask you to, first of all, reach out to people. The Silicon Valley Bike Coalition is a good one, but also especially to reconsider your minimum parking requirements, because until you reconsider your minimum parking requirements, it's going to be the case that if somebody wants to rent an apartment in Los Altos, that they absolutely have to rent a parking space as well. So these minimum parking requirements will continue to exclude people. And as you know, there are a lot of people that don't own cars. The elderly is one group, but there are many, many other ones. And I'd like to see the city make space for this type of a person who doesn't own a car. We have a lot of other benefits to lowering the minimum parking requirement as we build these 2,000 new housing units. Not only do we encourage more diverse residents, but we disincentivize driving if we make it difficult to park or charge for parking if you're going to be living in an apartment. So separating the cost of the apartment from the cost of the parking space. This would also, of course, reduce traffic. And the mayor was asking, or somebody did, about how we can bring along people who don't want this new housing. And one thing we can do is tell them that we're going to be encouraging these new residents not to use automobiles. And it would also reduce paved surfaces, which would reduce the heat in the summer. Right now they can become, in the summer they can become heat sinks. So it's always been a problem that anyone who doesn't have a car, basically they're not going to be renters in Los Altos.
Thank you.
So thank you for considering that outreach too.
Thank you, Elaine.
I'm sorry, I'm having a difficulty sharing the timer on my screen. For some reason, the timer is not coming up. So I am watching the time, and I don't know if Mr. Maginot might help me with the sharing the screen of the timer. But our next speaker is Jan Stokely.
Good afternoon, Mayor and City Council members. I'm Jan Stokely, Executive Director of Housing Choices. We have had an opportunity to meet with Mr. Biggs and Mr. Persicone to talk about the housing needs of Los Altos residents with developmental disabilities. And we'll be providing data that's required under the housing element. and also hopefully recommendations to take advantage and build on all the other ideas and recommendations I'm sure you'll receive in the months ahead. My questions really pick up on the theme of values, which was emphasized in the PowerPoint presentation, working with the community to clarify values. I think there are two values that I see kind of hardwired into the housing element. The first one is the value of each city doing their fair share to meet the regional housing need. And that's, of course, reflected in the RHNA goal, which is quite high. And so I wonder how many units were actually produced in the last housing element, and what's the level of change that's going to be needed to meet the new goal? And then my second question, if I can ask two, is that the other value statement that's in the housing element is to affirmatively further fair housing for categories of people who have historically faced discrimination and exclusion. And of course, for our organization, we definitely see that with people with disabilities. There are others as well. And so how will that value, which really means not just combating discrimination, but doing things differently so that you affirmatively include people who've been excluded from Los Altos. So how will you pursue that value, and how will you bring those values into discussion with the community?
Thank you, Jen, for those comments. I don't know if Mr. Biggs would like to respond, but the focus of today's study session is the proposed engagement strategy and taking feedback and comments on that strategy. Thanks for your comment on the values and your question related to the RHNA goals from the last cycle. I don't have that number off the top of my head. I don't know if Mr. Biggs does, but maybe if you send an email to public comment. So here he is. Mr. Biggs, do you have a quick answer for Jan?
I don't have a quick answer for Jan or the community tonight, but again, if you do send an email to my email address, we will get you the information.
Great, thank you. We can continue, Andrea.
Okay, our next speaker is Ann Paulson.
Good afternoon, Mayor Flagger and City Council. I'm Ann Paulson, a 34-year resident of Los Altos. I moved here with my husband in the mid-'80s when we were young professionals to settle down and start a family. But I'm sad that today, young professionals, even doctors married to doctors, can't afford to live here. We're turning into a place where only stupendously rich people and old people who are already here can live. And hey, I'm old, but I'm not ready for a senior community for a few years yet. Our housing element is the way to reverse this. We're mandated to plan for new housing for people of all income levels and conditions. It'll be good for Los Altos to succeed at this process. But planning for housing means planning for places for it to be built. And as far as the outreach is concerned, residents need to see the candidate areas for housing early in the process so we can winnow them down. This is sure to be an intense process, which will take time. And we also need to see lots of proposed sites and areas. So there'll still be enough of them after we whittle them down. We have to evaluate the realistic capacity of each site, the average expected from each site, allowing for the fact that many sites won't be developed as housing. The housing element is supposed to be a plan for our required housing to actually be built in the real world where many property owners decide not to do anything with their property. So we need to end up with a whole lot of sites so that enough of them actually get developed. I thank the City Council for having this meeting to get things started. Let's go. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne.
Our next speaker is Roberta, followed by Mercia. Roberta?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I do hope that the outreach is really leans to be scientific. because I know there are a lot of organizations in town that people belong to multiple organizations. They belong to the Rotary Club, and they also belong to the Chamber of Commerce, and they also belong to LACF. So, you know, I've been to community outreach before where we have yellow sticky papers and people get to vote 4 or 5 or 10 times. And that does not inspire trust in the process. So I hope you will make efforts to make sure that a lot of the people who are unheard community have voice. I do have other questions because obviously we need to be educated on SB 9 and what it is and what it isn't and what can really happen with it. I think there's a lot of misunderstandings of what happens when a lot is split. For example,
Roberta, I'm going to take separate public comments on the second study session item if you want to hold your comments on SB 9.
Okay. So I just, you know, I'll hold off on that. I just think that, you know, important thing is when you do the community outreach, I would really suggest that you have maps and diagrams and 3D models, because a lot of people learn visually, not necessarily after reading something, but some people learn that way. And I think you need to understand how to reach people in the site. And I know it'll be really helpful to me if I could see what a lot looked like.
Could you
Also,
repeat your last statement? I'm sorry, you got cut off. Could you repeat
I'm
your
sorry.
last statement?
Yeah, I said it would be good to be able to visually see what a lot would actually look like, what the houses on them with ADUs, with junior ADUs. I think that's important. I think it's important for us to know how many housing units we currently have now and how many lots we currently have now, because we have a lot of lots now that don't have housing. Like
Thank you, Roberta.
Thank you,
Roberta. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Marcia, followed by Damergy.
Marcia, can you hear us?
Yeah.
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, sorry about that. So yeah, thank you for taking my comments. I really appreciate it, and I think that hopefully this process is going to be involving. I heard all the groups, obviously, and then at one point, I hope that the city council and you know, the planning staff will take consideration also from developers, because again, at the end of the day, we know we have the pulse of what's happening in Los Altos. We understand the, you know, the areas that could be actually merged and actually being able to get more lots combined and be able to get a higher density on areas if the city identified by the city as potential sites for low, medium, or high density. As far as, you know, Mountain View did it before, I think it's going to be very important for them to be included in this conversation. Some of them, they may be willing to cooperate and help and be able to have multiple lots merged and be able to do larger projects on the areas that are more permitted and more efficient and more acceptable for the residents. I also believe that you know, at some point, you know, the HCD, which is going to be approving this housing element, as they stated on the 2017 letter, they already identified in that letter that El Camino Real, as an example, it's a high opportunity for high density developments for affordable housing. So if everybody reads the letter, I think it's pretty clear what they're pointing out, and I think that letter should be taken highly into consideration during this outreach and completion of the process. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcia.
The next speaker is Damergy, followed by Janine Valadez.
Hi, yeah, I'm Salim. I grew up in Los Altos. I've spent most of my life in Los Altos. And unfortunately, because of the high cost of housing, most of my friends and family have been pushed out of Los Altos because it's really difficult to afford. And so for me, this housing element is a once in a decade opportunity to make sure that middle-class people can afford to live in Los Altos. So one legal requirement that we have with this plan is to affirmatively further fair housing, and that includes the outreach portion. I hope that we put a lot of effort into contacting workers. They're also part of our community. Teachers, the school district and the high school are two of the top 10 largest employers in the city. It'd be very easy to reach them via the teachers union. We could also easily reach city employees and other workers in the city. I also hope that when we do this outreach to these groups, that we also correct for demographic biases. It's possible that we do outreach to all the right people, but that's still the majority of people who are, but still that there's some sort of skew in who's responding, such that we get a lot of homeowners who have a lot of time on their hands. So I hope that we apply the same sort of rigor that you would apply to any survey and correct for demographic biases. The only other thing I'd like to say is I hope that the process of creating a draft is also transparent. I think that's actually the most important part of the outreach. It's difficult to say in a vacuum what you would like to see. It's a lot easier to respond to what's in the plan. So I hope that components of the draft plan are released as they're created, so that way there can be sufficient outreach on the details. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this housing element. I hope that I can afford to settle down in Los Altos one day. And I hope that a lot of people can as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Salim.
Our next speaker is Janine Valadez, followed by John Baer.
Good evening. I wrote a letter earlier today, and I won't read through that whole thing, but I do want to bring up a few points about the outreach aspects of the housing element. And I encourage the council to be hopeful and positive and assertive in increasing housing in the city. I support the following endeavors and encourage the council and staff to consider them in today's session and in any future sessions as you draft the housing element outreach. First, conduct in-depth studies of the in-process housing element outreach strategies of other agencies around us, particularly and Saratoga, because they are doing a really good job and they're ahead of us, and they're really focusing on outreach, especially to a lot of underserved communities in their cities. Both cities have outlined and undertaken these outreach plans, so we have case studies that can show that they work. I value inventiveness, but it shouldn't take time away from actually doing outreach. I like the idea of creating task forces to engage residents in helping to target some of the communities that may be difficult to find, particularly undocumented people and people who are already below the poverty line that live in our city. And as Salim, all the segments that Salim mentioned, and we should incentivize some of these people and make sure to come in terms with raffles or gift certificates or meals, and then also bring them in at times when they're available. So there should be redundancy in our meetings. And finally, I really want to focus, we really should be focusing on quantitative methods to compile data so that our information is not biased and is not indicative of any kind of preconceived notions. Thank you.
Thanks, Janine.
Mayor Fliger, we have one more speaker, Valerie Soon.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Valerie Soon. I'm 30 years old and I work nearby at Stanford. I don't live in Los Altos, but I would love to live here. It seems like a very beautiful place. But, just a cursory search on Zillow shows that the price of renting is really expensive, not to mention buying. So that would certainly be out of reach for me, as well as for a lot of people in my generation. So I want to just encourage the council to take into consideration robust outreach to demographic groups such as renters, younger people, residents of all income levels in nearby cities who would like to live here but cannot, and who also don't work here but who would otherwise prefer to live in Los Altos. And I also echo previous speakers' comments about demographic biases in outreach. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. And so with that, let's close public comment, City Clerk.
Excuse me, we do have two more hands that were raised and I missed them. John Bear.
Okay, and so we do need to close public comment soon, so let's go to John for 2 minutes, and I'm looking, I don't see any other hands raised. Last call on public comment on the first study session item. Okay, go ahead, City Clerk, thank you.
John Bear, followed by Patricia Evans. She put her hand up.
All right, so I want to key off of a comment that was made by one of the prior speakers about one of the underserved groups in this town. And I think it presents a win-win opportunity for everyone. And those are people who live in the city or want to live in the city, who do not drive, who do not have cars. And I would love to see in our housing element a building or multiple sites dedicated for people who don't own cars, ideally situated near public transport. And in fact, those people who rent or buy those buildings are actually precluded from owning a car. I think that helps lower the cost of housing and addresses a lot of issues we have. And as I said, I think it's a tremendous win-win. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John.
The final speaker is Patricia Evans. Patricia?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I've lived in Los Altos for 40 years and raised my family here. And I have several comments. First of all, echoing something that Janine said, I would like to have the city educate the public and itself on best practices by looking at what other jurisdictions have done in terms of the housing element. And there are numerous examples of areas that are ahead of us in that process. And the second thing is echoing something Jan Stokely said, but also my own experience as the mother of a disabled child. I'd like to ask if Section 8 housing, the need for Section 8 housing will be included in any of the planning, because that, of course, addresses the disabled community as well as very low income. And the third area has to do with just one of the stakeholders. A number of people have mentioned the undocumented and other very low income people that serve in our community, that work in our gardens, that take care of our children, that clean our houses and so forth. And I assume, but would like to hear, that the Day Worker Center has been involved as a stakeholder. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patricia. Okay, thanks, Andrea. I'm going to bring it back to council for any final comments before we close this study session item. As I look for virtual or go ahead, Councilmember Weinberg.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm just curious, what is the next step that the subcommittee plans on taking?
I'm happy to take that question. So as pointed out earlier, we still have some work to do with the engagement strategy, developing the materials and really fleshing out how we're going to engage with these different groups. And so the subcommittee will continue to work with staff and the consultants in developing and reviewing these other pieces of the engagement strategy. So we'll be involved because you tasked us with working on the community engagement strategy, and that's what we will do until that portion of the process ends. And it's throughout the process, as you know. Councilmember Meadows.
In addition to whatever you and the consultant and staff have in mind for community engagement, I think we've seen a good example. Our community has been enjoying working with EEH on 330 Distal. So lessons learned there, right, in our own town. And I do think the comments about looking at the towns and the cities that are ahead of us and building off, you know, not duplicating the wheel, but building off what they've done. Let's go for it. It's not, you know, not proprietary. So that's my comments.
Thank you, Councilmember Meadows. And I don't see any more hands. City Clerk, do we have any comments from the Vice Mayor?
Not that I have received.
Okay, well, thank you. Thanks, staff.
She's saying no. She's saying that there is a comment coming.
Oh, there is. Oh, I thought she was saying no, there's no comment.
Oh, okay. No comments.
I
Okay.
can read
No
Anita. Okay. So thank you. We're going to close this study session. Thank you, Mr. Biggs, Ms. Lee, Mr. Persicone, and everybody involved. Thank you. We have a lot of work to do, but we're ready.
Yes, we are.
Oh, we will be ready.
Support and your comments and feedback this evening. It's appreciated.
Thank you. Okay, so next we will move on to discussion item number 2, which is compliance with SB 9 and the California housing mandates. And I see our city attorney and her colleague, Eric, have joined us. So I will turn it over to them.
Okay, and can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I'm just going to do a brief introduction. This is a compliance with SB 9 PowerPoint and also the California housing mandates. So we have put together a PowerPoint. We have been trying to focus on SB 9 specifically, but we will address some of the other laws. And so I am going to turn it over to Eric, and he is going to put the presentation together, and then he and I will answer questions. And this isn't a closed session, but we have an ask. We want to know what your ask is about, what you want to see, because our ask is we want to get a resolution drafted and back to the council before the council recesses in December. So our ask is you to provide us with the info, and some of the issues that you see are the absolute needs, must do right now. And then knowing that after January 1st, we will be working on a more formal ordinance that will go through DRC and Planning Commission and back to council. So we will provide you with the background, and then we need to have your input so we can do this as efficiently as possible. So I'm going to turn it over to Eric right now.
All right, thanks, Jolie. So as Jolie said, I'm going to give you a sort of short presentation on SB 8-9 to sort of kick off the discussion, and then I'll kick it back to Jolie. Together we can answer your questions, and then I'll let her take over the discussion on where we go from here. Just a housekeeping issue, based on some trouble I had earlier today with Zoom. If I advance the slides, can you all see that I'm advancing?
We can, but do you want to put it on presentation mode?
I don't know what that entails.
So if you, and I have to look. So on your screen, you should be able to do start presentation.
I don't see that written.
Do the drop down of display settings. Let's see if it's there.
Okay. Oh, display settings, I see. I don't see that.
So swap presenter. Let's see if that works.
Okay.
Swap the presentation. There we go.
Okay, perfect. Great. Thank you, Mayor. Okay, so this is the presentation on SB 8 and 9, which are 2 of several housing bills that just went through the legislature, just got signed by the governor last month, and will all become law in January, not leaving us a lot of time to get ready to figure out how we're going to implement them. I want to start with SB 8 just briefly. SB 8, so the picture here is meant to show expansion growth. SB 8 is the significant expansion on SB 330, which went into effect January 1st of 2020. SB 330 changed quite a bit about how we do housing entitlements in California. It was called the Housing Crisis Act of 2019. And it was adopted as a temporary measure because the legislature, I think, correctly perceives that we're in a housing crisis. We have more people who want to live in California than we have places for people to live. SB 8 expands on that in several ways. One way is that SB 330 was supposed to sunset in 2030, or I'm sorry, in 2025. It now sunsets in 2030. And just to be realistic, I think we can expect this year to keep being pushed out for some time at least. So for now, it's here to stay for a good decade. SB 8 also takes the protections of SB 330, which was meant to apply only to multifamily housing, and it extends them to single family homes. What does that mean? SB 330 created a preliminary application process where before the developer submits its formal application, it could submit a preliminary application and vest rights as of the date of that preliminary application. That is now extended to single family homes as well. That's a significant change. SB 330 created a 5 hearing rule in which we're only allowed to hold as a city 5 hearings on a project before we have to either approve or deny. That now applies to single family homes too. Another significant change is that SB 330 requires a staff level determination at the time the application is accepted for processing regarding whether or not the site is historic. That now extends to single family homes too, which is in Los Altos is a significant change in procedure. And also there's some replacement housing requirements in SB 330 that are highly technical. I don't want to get into them right here, but those now extend to single family homes too. So a lot of what we've taken the last 2 years to get used to for multifamily housing is going to apply to single family housing now too. Another thing that may not be super significant in Los Altos since we haven't seen many SB 35 applications, but the Permit Streamlining Act is now going to apply to SB 35 applications. That's for cities that see a lot of SB 35 applications, that's significant, but I don't think that's going to affect us very much. Okay, so SB 8, you probably will hear a lot about SB 8 in the municipal law, in the municipal government world. When you hear SB 8, think of it expanding SB 330 significantly. SB 9 is what I want to spend most of our time talking about. And some people have called this the end of single family zoning in California. That's probably a little bit of an exaggeration, but it does significantly get rid of single family zoning. A lot of people perceive a problem with single family zoning, especially here in the Bay Area, where we are bounded by 2 small mountain ranges and don't have a lot of land to expand into to create more housing, but we desperately need more housing. And so the legislature perceived that a solution would be to allow multiple dwelling units to be built on single family lots. And so that's what SB 9 attempts to accomplish. SB 9, if it applies, and I'll talk about where it applies in just a minute. If it does apply, you get one of 2 things or both of those things. You can take advantage of both provisions. You can get ministerial approval of housing units, and you're entitled to 2 primary dwelling units per single family site plus ADUs. It's actually not clear how many ADUs you get in the statute, but my best interpretation reading the ADU law in combination with SB 9, I read it that you get 1 ADU and 1 JADU plus your 2 primary dwellings ministerially approved. And so in other words, every single family lot that qualifies for treatment under SB 9 can become a 4-plex. If you have a vacant lot or if you tear down an existing home, you could build 2 primary dwelling units. If you have an existing home and you're going to keep that home, you can build 1 new primary dwelling units plus your ADUs. As I indicated, this is a ministerial process. That means that there's no hearing. City Council, Design Review Commission, Planning Commission will not see SB 9 applications. That's against state law. It's approved over the counter by staff. If you meet the requirements, you get your approval. There's no discretion, with one caveat that I'll mention in a second. We can apply local objective standards to projects. We can exercise some land use control through objective standards. That means no exercise of discretion, either you check the box or you don't. But those standards cannot preclude at least 2 units that are at least 800 square feet, and they cannot require rear and side yard setbacks of more than 4 feet. And the caveat to this being a completely objective process is that the building official, it's only the building official who has this authority, may make certain health or safety, may deny an application if the building official can make certain health, safety, or environmental findings. But the legislature has declared that these findings are intended to, we're not expected to be able to make these findings in most circumstances. They're intended to apply rarely, if ever. They have to be based upon objective, published health, safety, or environmental criteria. They can't be sort of made up ad hoc on the fly in order to deny a project. It's meant to be for serious health, safety, and environmental risks. I mentioned that the other thing that you can get with SB 9 is a ministerial lot split. So you can just have the units on your property, but not divide up the property into separate lots. Or you can divide the property into separate lots. And if you do that, you can also get ministerial approval of 2 houses per lot. The ministerial approval lot split, again, it's a ministerial over-the-counter process, no planning commission, no DRC, no city council review. It's over-the-counter by staff, and we cannot require offsite improvements, and we cannot require right-of-way dedications. We can require street access, and we can require public utility easements, but that's it. There are 2 special requirements in order to qualify for the ministerial lot split. One is that the owner has to sign an affidavit, or the applicant, I should say, has to sign an affidavit that the applicant intends to occupy a unit on the site for at least 3 years. This is not a deed restriction. This is only enforceable in basically a perjury prosecution. And of course, it's only that the applicant intends to live there. We can't actually make the applicant live there. The question is, on the date the applicant signed that affidavit, was their intent? The applicant can, or the two units can be built per new lot. The size requirements are that the lots are ideally supposed to be equal in size, but the smaller of the 2 cannot be less than 40% of the original, and neither lot can be less than 1,200 square feet. So we're talking, potentially pretty small lots here. We have the ability to require off-street parking to an extent, but to a very limited extent. We cannot ask for more than 1 off-street parking space per unit, and we cannot ask for any off-street parking if the property is within half mile of a high-quality transit corridor or major transit stop. That means 15-minute headways between buses, or if it's within 1 block of a car share vehicle. So if ZIP maintains a car share vehicle space within a block, then we cannot require parking in that case either. When does an applicant get these benefits? When can the applicant qualify for the ministerial approval of up to 2 houses per lot plus ADUs and/or the lot split? It applies in single-family residential zones. That's not defined. It should sort of be obvious on one hand what a single-family residential zone is, but when HCD has interpreted the term residential zone in other, not single-family residential zone, but residential zone in other contexts, they've included any zoning district where housing is allowed either as a multifamily or a mixed-use housing development, whether by right or with a CUP. And so potentially what single-family means could be more expansive than what we sort of envision when we think of a single-family residential zone, because it's not defined. The parcel has to be located in a city or certain unincorporated areas. Los Altos is incorporated, so we can just check that box. The project cannot involve demolition or alteration of housing that's currently subject or has been subject in 3 years to price or rent controls, or that's been occupied by a tenant. So if you have an existing housing have an existing house, and in the past 3 years, that's been occupied by a tenant, or if it's subject to rent or price controls, you can build your second house, but you don't get to demolish that primary dwelling to make room for a new one. And I feel like it's kind of an odd requirement. There's this requirement that with a couple of exceptions, you can't demolish more than 25% of existing structural walls. So the exceptions are if the city says you can by ordinance, or if no tenant has lived on the property in 3 years, anywhere on the property, not just in a particular unit. In that case, you can demolish more than 25% of existing structural walls. These are the things that have to be present, and then these are the things that can't be present. If any of these is true, then SB 9 doesn't apply. Most of these will probably not apply in Los Altos. The first is the site is prime farmland or farmland of statewide importance. Los Altos is an incorporated city, so I doubt we have much of that. The site can't include wetlands. It can't be in a fire hazard severity zone. It can't be a hazardous waste site. It can't be within an earthquake fault zone. It can't be within a flood hazard zone or regulatory floodway, although there are kind of ways out of that. The land can't be under a conservation easement. The land can't qualify as habitat under certain definitions, and it can't be a historic property. If these are met and these aren't met, then you get your parking reductions, your ministerial lot split if you want it, and you get the ministerial approval of up to 2 houses per lot, plus ADUs. The caveat on the ADUs that I want to mention is that if you do the lot split and the ministerial approval of houses, we don't have to approve ADUs. You just get 2 primary dwelling units per newly created lot, so 4 in total. So you don't do the lot split and you get 2 primaries, an ADU and a JADU, or you do the lot split and you can get 2 primaries. It's a little confusing, but essentially it breaks down to 4 units where there used to be only 1 allowed. Objective standards. I mentioned that the city can apply objective standards so that it does have some design control, even though this is intended to be a ministerial process. The city has some objective site development standards already in its code, but our design standards, our adopted design guidelines are for the most part very subjective. And none of those will be enforceable standards when it comes to SB 9 projects. And we have a very short period of time in which to develop objective standards so that we can maintain some design control over new houses that get proposed through SB 9. A point I want to make is that SB 9 allows you to build 1 or 2 primary dwellings. And so homeowners could use it to build just one, as a vehicle to build 1 new home on their lot. It doesn't have to be to build 2 lots. And so I think a lot of things that currently undergo design review just won't anymore because of SB 9. And so we need to plan for that. So we want to encourage housing development for all the reasons we talked about in the last study session, but we also want it to be done in a responsible way. I apologize if whoever owns this house is out there. I just looked on Pinterest for lime green home because I just wanted to emphasize that if we don't have any objective standards, I'm not fond of lime green. So I've been saying you can build a lime green home if we don't, we don't have a standard saying you don't. You could build a home that isn't really very articulated, that may not fit within the context of the Los Altos community. And so it's important that we have some objective standards in place very soon so that we're ready for SB 9 to come through. Jolie and I and planning staff have kind of talked about a path forward to make sure we're ready for January 1st. And we would propose to you, I don't even call this the bronze, silver, and gold standard. I call it the cubic zirconia bronze and gold standard. We would propose to you that before January 1st, that your council adopt a resolution identifying some basic objective standards. What can't we live without? What's most necessary to make sure that we continue to get high quality homes in Los Altos built, even if we can't subject projects to discretionary review. we only have 3 meetings left before the end of the year. Staff is heavily busy with other initiatives, including the housing element. There really isn't time to take this through the processes we would normally go through by taking things to Planning Commission and DRC and getting lots of community input. And so I think that, you know, I hate to use the word quick and dirty, but to have something in place so that we don't completely lose design control, we should have some basic resolution in effect. And the ordinance code gives, the municipal code gives your council the ability to adopt design guidelines by resolution. So we don't need an ordinance to do this. Then, you know, we can begin right away with developing by early next year some more comprehensive and more thought out objective design standards that can be adopted hopefully early next year. And then, you know, ideally, there would be some long-term work put into that, as has been done, you know, with the ongoing process of developing objective design standards for multifamily housing. And that may or may not entail working with a consultant, but we really do see this being an iterative process. Whatever you adopt doesn't have to be the final say in design standards for the city. We can continue to flesh this out as we develop the process. And so what we really, you know, need some input on is, you know, number one, the council's general impressions of all this and how we move forward. And we can think about, you know, what kinds of standards we want to apply to homes in Los Altos if we're moving from a discretionary process to an objective ministerial process. Do we want to control color scheme? Are there certain materials that don't look good in Los Altos? Do we want to think about some of those site development standards, plate heights, etc.? And I want to suggest to you that we need to be careful not to apply a different set of, you know, generally different set of criteria to SB9 projects than we apply to non-SB9 projects with the goal of sort of discouraging people from taking advantage of SB9, because that would really not be in keeping with SB9. We really need to be thinking about what kinds of design standards do we want in general for homes in Los Altos, since the state is really pushing us to move to ministerial processes for homes throughout our community. And with that, I'm going to kick it back to Jolie to see if she has anything else to add before we take your questions.
No, thank you, Eric. And I know, you know, we have been discussing this with staff. We've talked to other agencies about really the path forward. And so we do want some input from the council about, you know, what you can live, you know, what you can live with, what you know, what do you want to change or keep. So those are sort of the bullet points, the criteria we need to hear from you as council. The one thing that there's been some discussions out in the city world where there, you know, there's ways of trying to like limit the city's involvement or limit the requirements of SB9. And at this point, I think we just need to get some objective standards and then flesh out some of those things after the first of the year with the DRC and the Planning Commission and the council, but not try to do anything too risky at this point, but just, you know, what are the big ticket items that we want to maintain in our design standards at this point. So
thank you, Jolie and Eric. And again, thanks also for framing the discussion. The focus is on providing feedback to our attorneys on what we want to see in the urgent design objective rules that we're going to try to get in place by January 1st. And so with that framework, I see the Vice Mayor has her hand raised. So City Clerk, can you please read her question? And we're doing questions right now. Then we'll go to public. So oh, she took her hand down. Okay. Okay.
Wait. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Vice Mayor. So let's do questions. I see Councilmember Meadows has her hand raised.
Thank you, Mayor. A question for Mr. Ramakrishnan. Thank you for your presentation. So I want to clarify, because I've heard you say, I think, that SB 9 takes us to 4 units on a lot, whereas it was 1. My understanding is we essentially could have up to 3 units on a lot, and now it's 4. Can you please clarify?
Yes, that's a good point, and I'm sorry, I spoke a little bit too quickly there. Yes, you get the single family home, and you get, right now you get an ADU and a JADU. With this, you could get the second single family home, or if you do the lot split and the ministerial approval, you get 2 primaries on each lot. So really 4 primaries. So thanks for the clarification.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to check if my hearing was correct. That's all, Mayor, of my questions.
Thank you, Councilmember Meadows. Any other questions? Okay, I just have 2 quick questions. Eric, the first has to do with really defining some of these terms. And I know it's a very new law, and so I don't know if that has been done yet, but as you were going through, there were so many things, high transit corridor, different things that I know serving in different capacities, they've not been defined. And so do we have, what resources will we look to really understand what some of these terms mean?
Yeah, so I mean, basically, if you have, it's a high transit corridor if you have a bus that goes by at
Every
15
minutes, yeah.
Yeah, every 15 minutes. And it's a major transit stop if you have an intersection of buses with 15-minute headways. Really, the only places that I'm aware of personally in Los Altos that meet these criteria is near the El Camino Real. Outside of that area, I'm pretty sure we don't meet these criteria anywhere else.
And then Eric, we could go into, there are some other terms that we've, all of us local agency attorneys are still debating. Like, you're supposed to provide access. And is that pedestrian access? Is that vehicle access?
Yeah.
And so that is a real wild card. And then the other one that is lacking, and then the access, is that for fire safety access? So access is still out there and not defined. And well, it's problematic. And then also what a ride share is and a ride share stop. And so there, we'll be sort of grappling with this as we go forward, just like the ADU, and we still get questions, even though we have an ADU ordinance that went to HCD, I think 3 or 4 times. There's still some anomalies that don't really fit in the certain categories. And so we work with staff to try to make these ADUs meet the ADU ordinance and also the spirit of the ADU law. We'll be doing the same thing with this SB 9. Are we going to, with these objective standards, and then as we go forward with more detailed objective standards, I think we'll be getting some more interpretations maybe from HCD or just really how they will apply, but it's going to be a process.
No, it is. And as we develop these urgent rules, it's good to know which areas are just exempt so we don't spend time trying to develop rules for those areas. So I'll hold my other questions. I do want to go to public comment. I don't see any hands raised, but City Clerk, do we have any members of the, oh, here we go. So let's do 2 minutes for each speaker.
Okay, and if Mr. Megino can help me with the timer, please. Our first speaker is John Baer.
So this obviously is going to be a nasty, messy process. But I think we should look carefully at as many factors in the urgency ordinance or urgency rules that the council places. Ultimately, privacy and bulk and mass are critical in our community, as is compatibility of materials and design in neighborhoods. And to the extent we can figure out ways to make those objective, that would be really good. The other thing that I want to mention is that we have a lot of flag lots in this town. And we want to make sure that some of the things that we have been put in place for flag lots do not go by the wayside. If I don't think I'm out of date in saying that currently our flag lot ordinance does not allow two-story construction, and we want to make sure that we retain that in any future objective standards and make sure we think about some of the things around flag lots because there are so many of them in our town. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Our next speaker is Roberta, followed by Salim. Roberta?
Hey, it's Roberta.
We can hear you.
The first thing is that, the idea that the price of land is going to decrease is really not true. If a developer can come in and buy a piece of land and build 4 or 5 or 6 pieces of homes on land, the prices are going to go up, not down. And so that's really important. I'm really glad that John Bear brought up the flag lots because that's a very big concern for me. I happen to live on a flag lot, and we need to have fire access to the lot in the back. Fire circulation for that, and in relation to objective standards in relationship to fire protection, I think we should look at the kinds of materials that are non-flammable, because as Los Altos Hills grows, we become more in danger of having fires in our area. We also need to look at tree removal. Are we going to destroy our canopy and have everybody taking the trees in the yards down? That's a big concern. And there's also deed restrictions that allow the city to deed restrict a property for low-income housing, and I think we should take advantage of that. Unfortunately, I still think that this is going to be a major challenge, and we're still going to be able to achieve what we want for the middle class. My daughters grew up here. They're professionals, make a lot of money, and they cannot afford to live here. I think some real important things. Like I said before, we need 3D models. We need diagrams and maps to show what is this going to look like in the community, so people can get an idea of what is really going to happen on this lot or that lot. So I hope that staff will work on that when they're doing education to the community. Thank you.
Thanks, Roberta.
Our next speaker is Salim Demirji, followed by Janine Valadez.
Hi, yeah, I'm Salim. I wanted to thank staff for their presentation. One thing that Attorney Ramakrishnan pointed out that I think deserves an exclamation point is that SB 9 also applies to single-family homes. And I think this is an amazing thing for residents. It means that they'll get faster approval of their designs. It means they won't have to go through an expensive process of having multiple iterations on their designs. It means that we won't have conflicts in neighborhoods like the ones that are going through the design review committee right now, where people in a neighborhood have a conflict over a new home, and it ends up leading to animosity, which is really not good. It'd be a lot better to have objective standards and just stick to them. And then the only thing, I think SB 9 is amazing for the community. I think this is pro-resident. It saves residents a lot of hassle, whether they want to build a single family home or a duplex. I definitely think that objective design standards are, a great. I would support like landscaping requirements. That often makes a place look nicer if you have some trees. And in terms of other requirements like lot coverage or floor area ratio, I'm curious if staff have an opinion on whether SB 330 would prevent us from reducing the intensity of land use on these parcels, and whether those can be parts of the objective standards that are created. I also think staff was right to point out that we should try to act within the spirit of SB 9. A lot of cities tried to oppose the ADU law as much as possible, and then there was this, an iteration of laws that were enacted by the state to undo that. We would be wasting staff time if we tried to, obstruct SB 9 in Los Altos. It'll just be another series of bills that correct that in the next cycle. So I'm glad it passed, and I look forward to seeing some more duplexes in Los Altos. Thank you.
Thanks, Salim.
Madam Mayor, I have one more speaker. That's Janine Valadez.
Thank you.
Janine?
Hello. My comment will be brief this time. I want to caution any objective standards that kind of artificially, can you hear me?
Yes.
That artificially raise the cost of building, which will then be handed down to the renters or buyers for the sake of, looking like the rest of Los Altos. In particular, articulation is an example. I know we have very strict subjective expectations about articulation in the homes we build. While I'm not in favor as a homeowner, I don't like square boxes. I think that, I hope we don't make objective standards that are too strict on that account, because it just raises cost. The other thing is, in terms of sustainability, I would favor objective standards surrounding sustainability and environmental considerations. And I would support material requirements related to fire mitigation, but not necessarily to, making everybody look the same, or again, add cost to the building of these homes. And the final comment I want to make, it has to do, it's more subjective, which is there are a lot of people that say that, we can continue to divide our lots and the housing prices will continue to go up on those lots. And you just look at realty data, it doesn't support. I mean, the most expensive houses in our area are the ones on the big lots, or if it's slightly smaller lots, it's because they're super fancy. So if you take a lot that you could sell a $6 million house, and you divide it into two, you're not going to sell two $6 million houses. I think it's just reasonable that in general, prices will come down a little bit at least. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Janine. Okay, I don't think we have any other speakers, City Clerk.
You are correct.
Okay, and I see the Vice Mayor wants to get us started with the comments. So go ahead, City Clerk.
Okay, here I go. Thank you to the City Attorney's Office and to Eric for the really good explanation of these new laws. I absolutely concur in the need to pass a resolution prior to January 1, 2022, following the 3 steps Eric outlined. We need urgently to pursue a course of action as determined by the City Attorney that will maximize our control within the bounds of the new state laws, and then work through additional changes to our zoning code. Many cities are scrambling to do this, and I offer the following suggestions to be put in a resolution regarding SB 9 to be approved prior to January 1, 2022, based on drafts of work done elsewhere. Number 1, adopt each existing objective standards as apply. 2, place a maximum total of 4 units on the 2 lots resulting from a split. Eric mentioned this, but it should be specified. 3, adopt the parking and setback requirements in the Act. 4, establish the applicant residency affidavit process with residency to begin upon issuance of the certificate of occupancy for newly built units. 5, impose an affordable covenant, perhaps of 30 years, with at least a moderate income level for 1 unit. Specify the city's requirement and right to impose impact and/or development fees and easements. 7, allow for the exemption of any areas or districts as provided by the Act. 8, affirm the ability and process for the city to deny a project based on the adverse impact criteria as allowed in the act, and then in parentheses, public health and safety, physical environment with no feasible method to mitigate or avoid, close parentheses. 9, require notification 500-foot radius for any SB9 proposed project site. 10, the most critical objective standards, parentheses, for example, height plate maximums, limits on balconies and second-story glazing, close parentheses. The staff can best identify objective standards for most homes. The Design Review Commission has extensive experience we should draw on immediately regarding two-story buildings. As we learned with our commercial objective standards, codifying design rules can be more difficult, as will streamlining the procedure to make sure we don't break the 5-meeting limit and create a preliminary application process. These changes have a huge potential to affect all our neighborhoods. Our residents want to get this right, and they want us to act quickly. That's the end.
Thank you, and thanks, Vice Mayor and City Attorney and Eric. I'll take comments from the other council members, but a lot of what the Vice Mayor mentioned, I know is contained in a sample resolution that was being circulated. And so I really would appreciate you both weighing in on those terms of a resolution. Obviously, a group drafted it, and I want to hear from our attorneys on whether or not you would recommend us having similar provisions in a resolution we adopt. So I just wanted to flag that for both of you as something I want to come back to because I know that draft resolution has been circulating.
Who else? I can comment right away, right now, where we are going to do this by resolution. We are not going to do it by an MOU. So I'm already saying it's going to be a resolution adopted by it's not going to be an MOU with some unknown party or something. So we will do a resolution, and we do have that, and we will look at that. And we are going to be careful and mindful of Housing Accountability Act issues as well, because they will come into play as well.
Exactly, my point exactly. Thank you, City Attorney. Who would like to go next on council to comment or start giving feedback and direction? We heard from the Vice Mayor a list of items she would like to see contained in the resolution. Any other suggestions, thoughts? Councilmember Meadows.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I wasn't sure if I got the right button.
It's our Halloween, Councilmember Meadows, it's our Halloween meeting.
Yes, full of horrors. Yes. So I'm not going to comment on the Vice Mayor's suggestions because they kind of went quickly. I'll leave that to our attorneys. And some of them I sounded good and some of them I wasn't quite clear on. But I want to talk about the priorities slide that Eric, that you showed us. And then I also have a suggestion. So we have never in Los Altos talked about stylistic or color choices. I'm not sure that we have any lime greenhouses in Los Altos. Probably we don't want a lot of them, I would agree, but we've never dictated, and to my knowledge, serving on design review and planning, we don't dictate color and we don't dictate style. So I would question whether color scheme is something that we want to include or not. In terms of materials, I do think that there's some that might be a rule out. I know, having served on planning commissioner with a longtime former commissioner Bresic, she had very distinct feelings about windows and which windows we didn't want to use in Los Altos. And there's probably some of that. But again, along with the style comments, I don't think we should be prohibiting specific materials unless they're not perceived to be of the quality. We usually talk about quality in terms of design in Los Altos. So I think we have to be very careful on that. Lot coverage is probably tricky given the 4-foot setback language of SB 9. Second floor ratios, I think we actually have some good standards in place for that. I'm not sure that they would be any different unless you want to argue that the reduced potential setbacks might change that. Plate heights, I believe we do have standards there already. What I was going to suggest is I'm not, certainly this council doesn't have any architects, and I'm not sure that our attorneys are either. And so maybe if you could tap into, say, one architect from DRC, one architect from Planning Commission, and get some feedback, they can probably give you some raw material, some ideas to work with there. Because I think anytime we design from the dais, talk about horrors, we're going to get them. So that would be my suggestions and my comments.
Yeah, and if I may add, I know staff, Guido from DRC and Planning Commission, he has a list of some of the items that the DRC and the Planning Commission routinely look at, which that are objective and that we can. So we already have a little bit of a list going right now.
Good.
So we will tap into that, but that's a good idea with the DRC and the Planning Commission, maybe checking in with them on some of the wants and you may want something, but then is it a must or is it just a want? So we can look at that.
Yeah, and I should have mentioned, of course, Guido and John working with him, but I know former Chair Keurig is an architect on DRC, and former Chair Ahi on Planning Commission is an architect designer as well. So we have lots of skills to tap into.
And to that point, just to clarify, I think what Councilmember Meadows is suggesting, City Attorney, based on the limited time we have, is to reach out to those two individually and not the full commissions, to see if they'll engage with you, John, Guido, and Eric to develop a proposed resolution to take back to council. Okay, so Councilmember Lee Eng.
Thank you. Thank you both for the presentation you had given. Some points I want to make sure that we cover in our resolution is to ensure that the multiple units are ADA compliant, because if it's only going to be that the owner is going to reside in there for 3 years, I want to make sure that when they rent it after the 3 years and they rent it out, I want to make sure that we ensure that these units are ADA compliant, unless the owner chooses to reside in that unit even longer. The other point, when you said that the applicant signs an affidavit that the applicant intends to occupy one unit as a principal resident, I want to ensure that we have some teeth in our ordinance or our resolution, in our ordinance that we plan to pass after, to make sure that if the person does not reside in it for the 3 years, that there's a penalty to pay for that. And I want that to be not just a slap on the wrist type of penalty. It should be a substantial fine. And also, even when we didn't think that, or I think you were saying, here's the list on the slide, that we do have areas of homes that are in high fire zones. So I do want to make sure that We continue to have sprinklers in all units, just like we allow for sprinklers in any new construction. So I would like to see sprinklers to ensure the safety on anyone in case of fire. And then let me see. We already addressed materials. Vice Mayor addressed a lot of items that I did concur with. And my concern is, like, we are all throwing in or stating that these are things we'd like to see. So what is the next steps to ensure that the things that we are suggesting are part of that resolution?
So I'll take that, Councilmember Liang. So the city attorney and I, and I'm sure others are taking a running list of the feedback we're hearing from everybody. They will respond on the things that legally we cannot do. And then the other things they will work with, I like the suggestion and looks like everybody likes it as well, with a team to put together a draft resolution that includes all the other things that we could legally do and bring that back to us to review and hopefully adopt the resolution.
Okay, so if also when you clarified that you were saying that there were up to 4 units a lot, right? I want to make sure, so then if someone has a single family resident house on a lot right now, you're saying they can do the lot split, they can have 2 primary residents, and then they, on top of that, they're going to have other ADUs. So I think what we also want to do is put a limit as to when they split up these lots. We don't want to see 8 units in that what was once a single family lot now becomes 8 units. We want to see maybe a maximum of 4 within the 2 lot splits. And I think I heard the vice mayor mentioning that. So
Eric can chime in, or I can too. Right now, if you do the lot split, you can't go back and do another split. So you can't do repeated splits. So, but we can put that in the resolution to make that clear.
yeah, I want to make it clear because by my understanding from reading the bill, someone can go and do the split. They can have 2 primary residences, adding on to the 2 primary residences, adding on ADUs onto that. So you're saying that you're clear, but I'm still not clear on what you think you're clear on.
So you can get, if you don't do the ministerial lot split, if you just do the ministerial approvals, you get your 2 primary dwellings and you get your ADU and your JADU, so 4 units total. If you do the lots, there's some ambiguity in the law, but I think that's the best interpretation. If you do the lot split, then you get 2 primaries. We're not required to allow ADUs if the property owner takes advantage of both the lot split and the ministerial approval. So in either case, you're getting 4 units on that lot, whether they do the lot split or not.
So I think when we write that resolution, like you said, there's ambiguity in the law, but we want it clear on what we expect in our city.
Sure.
On a lot.
And if I may jump in here, to respond to some of the suggestions earlier from Councilmember Enander, I think there is some value in codifying in our regulations what the state law already indicates, just to make it clear that we're applying the state rules in our city in case there's any question about that. But I do want to say that in terms of what we can do and can't do. So some of you are lawyers and you'll be familiar with the term field preemption. The legislature intended to occupy the field of regulation here. They did not intend to allow us to add on extra requirements that they didn't put into the law. So if they said we're allowed to have objective design standards, we can impose objective design standards, but we can't impose other kinds of standards beyond design standards because the legislature didn't say we could do that. I want to be clear that we don't get to do things that the statute doesn't allow us to do. But we can make clear that we're going to enforce the statute in our city.
Yeah, and Eric, stuff like the fire sprinklers, those would just be building code requirements that would be normally imposed.
That's
Right.
right for fire sprinklers, definitely, yes.
Yeah.
And then also when we talk about materials, we can also identify meeting the NAFA requirements, the National Association Fire Agency requirements.
I mean, to the extent that that's already, I'm not super familiar, you know, I'm not the best expert on what the building code requires, but if that's in there, that's already required regardless. But if it's not, if it's truly a design standard, you know, we talked about materials, then yes, we can specify that kind of thing in the resolution.
But because it's it's going to be a higher density, wouldn't we be able to clarify some of the expectations we may want to ensure safety?
We can impose design standards, that's it.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, thanks, Councilmember Liang. Councilmember Weinberg.
Thank you, Mayor. I know we don't have a lot of time, so I will try to be brief. I find myself substantially in agreement with what Councilmember Meadows said. I love the team approach that's been suggested. I want to thank Eric for his comments. I think he said much more eloquently what I want to say, which is that when we put this resolution together, and I think we all agree we do need a resolution, we do need objective standards, let's put together a resolution that is substantially in accord with the spirit of SB 9. And the spirit of SB 9 is we need to increase the stock of housing throughout the state of California and certainly in the city of Los Altos. I am not in favor of the United Neighbors resolution that's been circulated and that the vice mayor has proposed in certain points. I vehemently am opposed to any kind of substantial penalty for a violation of the affidavit. I mean, someone could legitimately intend to live in a unit for 3 years, but a year later, their employer wants to move them out of state, or they have to move away to take care of a sick relative. I mean, a circumstance like that is going to happen, and you're going to charge them what, $10,000, $100,000? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. The ideas behind, the concepts behind SB 9 are really a good faith attempt to try to increase the housing stock. And if people are in good faith complying with SB 9, then they should be allowed to take advantage of the benefits of that, because that is the mandate from Sacramento. So again, in conclusion, I really hope that our resolution is in the spirit of promoting people to use SB 9 as opposed to making it harder for them to employ.
Yeah. And one thing I can add, Councilmember Weinberg, is in a resolution, we can't impose penalties. If we were going to go that route, penalties and fines and anything in penal type nature needs to be in an ordinance. And so we would have another look at this when we go and do an ordinance. But the resolution is really going to be just dealing with the high level design standards.
Thanks for the city attorney. I'll just underscore what I said before. You know, this study session is really to give our feedback and thoughts, exactly what we're all doing. And then our city attorneys will work to see what's doable, what's legal, and come back to us in their report and say, we weren't able to do this because of X, Y, Z. And so for me, for example, the United Neighbors resolution, which our vice mayor referred to a lot of the elements, for me, I'm looking to our city attorneys to tell us whether or not we could legally have those terms in the resolution. So now they will come back to us and say, here's a draft resolution. Here are the things we didn't include, and here is why. In the interest of time, a lot of the items that are on my list have already been mentioned. I do want to emphasize a few that have not been mentioned. City Attorney, I would like to see in the urgent resolution the setbacks addressed, and I know there's the 4-foot limitation in the law. But as we saw with the ADU discussion that we did last week when we were adopting those ordinances, we spent a lot of time talking about that. And a matter of fact, I do think a lot of the ordinance sections that we have related to ADUs may apply here, because during those discussions, we were talking about having multiple units on lots. And so when we talk about privacy, landscaping, lot coverage, I do want to see those addressed in this urgency resolution. And I do think, looking at the ADU ordinance that we adopted, I think 1.5 years now, that is a good resource to get an idea of what should be included in this urgency resolution. The only thing I have on my list is the notice requirement, and I'm glad the Vice Mayor mentioned that. I also have that on my list. Again, I will look to you to come back and tell us, you know, if this is something that's optional that we can do, or if there's a legal prohibition. And what was the last thing I have on my list? There was one other thing. On the flag lots, one of our residents mentioned, I think 2 residents mentioned our flag lots. And so to the extent that we need to specifically address flag lots, let's do that in the urgency resolution. I don't know if we can, but if there's a way, just like how we treat flag lots differently in Los Altos, if there's a way to treat them differently as well as in an urgency resolution, that's something I would look to the city attorney to include in the urgency resolution. But I think we have covered all the different topics. I have Anita's, the Vice Mayor's list, the forma team recommendation, the ADA compliance, the affidavit, and whether or not we can impose a fine or, you know, put some teeth in that requirement. I think, you know, Councilmember Meadows already touched on, we don't have a color scheme requirement right now in Los Altos. And then the materials, that may be a very limited list. And I think you heard from a couple of us talking about lot coverage, floor ratios, plate heights, and so on. So that's my list. Any other, I see the Vice Mayor. Go ahead, Vice Mayor.
Okay, her statement begins, Councilmember Weinberg, I did not propose any penalties, nor would any be appropriate. I believe there are 3 architects on the Design Review Commission, as well as very competent residents with years of experience on looking at 2-story residences. I previously asked that we solicit input from all of them and believe we would be shortchanging ourselves if we don't. I think we need some insight as to whether there are different fire building codes for multifamily rental than for residential. There is a real question as to whether any multifamily rules, and that's in quotes, would apply if there are duplexes, for example. The end.
Thanks, Vice Mayor. And especially that last point, you know, whether or not the multifamily unit rules would apply to the duplexes. That's it. That's what would apply. So great question. So City Attorney, we're going to look to you to come back. And I will say, you know, hearing the presentation, as I was listening, I kept thinking training for our staff. Please. And I know the Santa Clara County Planning Collaborative that Mr. Biggs is very familiar with, they're putting together FAQs as well. And so as soon as that's available and has been vetted by our team, I think it would be good to have that available, because I have heard SB 9 presentations enough times now, and it's still not all clear to me. And so I think it's really helpful for residents to also understand what this is. So training for our staff, FAQs for our community.
We did training yesterday with staff.
Perfect.
So the first part of the training. So we're starting.
Checklists, training. Okay, any other comments? Any other questions? City Attorney, do you have enough information to develop our draft resolution to bring back to us?
Yes, I do. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. With that, I'm going to adjourn the study sessions, and let's take a 5-minute break, and then we will start our closed session. Thank you. We will adjourn at 6:06.
Thank you.
Thank you.